The September the 11th attacks were a series of 4 coordinated terrorist attacks by the Islamic terrorist group called Al-Qaeda. They were against the United States on the morning of Tuesday, September the 11th, 2001. The attack resulted in 2,977 fatalities, over 25,000 injuries, and substantial long-term health consequences, in addition to at least $10 billion in infrastructure and property damage. 9/11 is the single deadliest terrorist attack in human history, and the single deadliest incident for firefighters and law enforcement officers in the history of the United States, with 343 and 72 killed respectively. Suspicion quickly fell onto Al-Qaeda. The United States responded by launching the War on Terror and invading Afghanistan to depose the Taliban, which had failed to comply with US demands to expel Al-Qaeda from Afghanistan and extradite their leader, Osama bin Laden. The destruction of the World Trade Center and nearby infrastructure seriously harmed the economy of New York City and had a significant effect on global markets. Wall Street was closed until September the 17th, and the US and Canadian civil airspaces until September the 13th. It completely shaped the way that you travel through airports. The way that you live your life would be forever changed by the events of 9/11. Tonight on TTM Conspiracies, we take a look at some of the more grey areas and try to put a different perspective to the official narrative. Welcome to the TTM podcast. So James, we're back again.
We are.
How are you doing?
I'm doing well. I'm certainly doing better than the last time I saw you when I had a bit of a cold.
Yeah, I remember it was a difficult one. So tonight we leave the big kickoff behind on TTM Sports and we pick up the TTM Conspiracies part of the show, where tonight we obviously talk about 9/11. Initial thoughts on that?
Initial thoughts? It's exciting, actually. We've had a good time doing the sport pods. Now it's time to maybe touch on something a little bit more serious, possibly. Looking forward to it.
So what we're going to do is literally dive into all different areas of these attacks from that horrible day, where we talk about the background of the Twin Towers themselves. We talk about the collapse, the attacks on the Pentagon, Flight 93, Building 7, the alleged terrorists, Bin Laden and his links to the Bush family, which are well documented. And then at the end, we'll do a bit of a summary as well. And in the likes and subscriptions and the comments sections of the podcast, please don't be afraid to put what you think happened. First of all, we're going to kick off with a brief history of the Twin Towers themselves. So, James, do you want to take that one away?
Yeah, so the buildings were built in 1973. It was at a time where New York as a city was looking for sort of a real showpiece building, if you like. I think it was the largest building in New York at the time, certainly the highest. So the Port Authority group of New Jersey and New York, they decided they were going to build this thing, and they looked at many sites. One of them particularly well known is down on the Hudson River. Was another potential site. This is the one they went for, right in Manhattan down there. This was built in 1973
by Minoru Yamasaki, who is the architect. He came up with the specific idea for the Twin Towers. Random fact on Minoru Yamasaki, he was afraid of heights.
Really?
Afraid of heights, and he constructed some of the biggest buildings ever known to man at that particular time. So well done, Minoru.
It was at the time it was built. I think the David Rockefeller was involved in the conception of it. Certainly the idea of it. It was a very successful project in the end. A lot of big business in there. Incidentally, there was an initial attempt at bombing at the World Trade Center, which happened in 1993. This was actually it was a car bomb. It was actually in a truck. So there was a truck driven into the underground parking lot down in the bottom of the World Trade Center, and 6 people were actually killed. The intention was to bring down both towers, but that didn't happen. So the attack was actually carried out by a guy called Ramzi Youssef. He was made as the ringleader for this one, and he was a Kuwaiti national. There's a lot of weird things going on with this one. Some FBI involvement. A guy named Ahmad Salem, who was an Egyptian fella. He was an FBI informant at the time, and he actually informed the FBI of the plot to blow up the World Trade Center. So what they did, they basically said, okay, we're going to supply you with all this equipment. You're going to go to these guys, Ramzi Youssef and his associates. You're going to help him make the bomb effectively. So the FBI, in a sense, actually formulated the plan, but the aim was for them to make the bomb was going to be fake.
Right, okay.
Obviously, in the end, it didn't turn out that way. So the FBI were aware that this was going to happen at the time. They knew there was a plot. They knew there was going to be a bombing. They even participated in certainly facilitating giving the tools to carry this out.
So we talk about potential FBI involvement. I do have some statistics that I've pulled up from the American people themselves as to false flag operations, as if you were. For instance, did you know that in 2006, a poll into the Twin Towers and those horrible events of 9/11 that we are talking about, 33% of Americans believe that it was an inside job. I can also tell you that 50% believe that Pearl Harbor was a false flag operation. They knew that the Japanese were plotting to carry out those attacks at Pearl Harbor. And for a nation to have 50% of its occupants to believe that that was an inside job smacks of real distrust in their government. And also, again, with Lee Harvey Oswald, the killer or alleged killer of President Kennedy, over 73% believed in 2003 that this was potentially also a false flag operation.
And that's what we're talking about here, potentially false flag operations, used for political gain, used to improve public support for sort of military action. Touching back on the 1993 bombings, another main suspect, an associate of this Ramzi Youssef, was a guy named Mohammed Salameh, and he was actually arrested in the aftermath of the 1993 bombings at the World Trade Center. He was arrested. He was then released. The day he was released, he just traveled back to Iraq, and he was never found. Bear in mind, this is a main suspect for a potentially, 6 people died, potentially bringing both towers down at this stage in 1993. I mean, that's quite staggering, really. Never found.
Unbelievable.
The issue was 6 people died. Obviously, that's not good. They wanted to get some sort of terror legislations passed through Congress, stricter legislation to allow for stricter, sort of harsher treatment of terror suspects.
Okay.
Now, the incident in 1993 wasn't enough to get those passed. Not enough people had died. Terror wasn't necessarily seen as big a threat back then. This all changed, obviously, when you had the Oklahoma bombings.
Of course.
So that was the 1993 bombings. Very strange. FBI involvement, suspects going back to the Middle East and never being found, potential informants, the FBI knowing it was going to happen. That to me doesn't sit right, certainly from the offset.
Yeah, we'll touch again on the CIA and FBI in Building 7. Some other revelations to come out about that. It does state that quite simply that there is no smoke without fire.
Fast forward to 1998, the Port Authority have decided that the World Trade Center as a facility is not really doing as well as they would hope. They're thinking about selling it, maybe leasing it out. They're struggling to pay the city tax. In the year 2000, they only actually managed to pay $29 million out of a $100 million bill. So right there, they're $71 million in debt to the city in the year 2000. So eventually, it was agreed that they would sell the World Trade Center. Obviously, mass bidding ensued. There was a lot of interest from obviously real estate moguls and the like. Eventually, it was sold to a guy named Larry Silverstein. Ever heard of the name Lucky Larry?
Yeah, I've heard this name. A real player is what you can really state on that. Interesting that he did take it over, and no doubt you'll fill us in why.
He did. Now, Larry Silverstein actually already owned Building 7.
Yeah.
Now, when he eventually purchased the World Trade Center in 2001, in April 2001, bearing in mind this is, 5 months before 9/11? So he already owned Building 7. Now, there was a lot of skepticism about him at the time. Did he have the experience to deal with a facility this large? He hadn't owned something of this magnitude before. He certainly had the capital. He managed to come up with that. So what he had to pay for the World Trade Center initially was a £616 million down payment, with an annual rent obviously applied to that as well. You're talking about $3.2 billion as the actual price for the World Trade Center.
Is that a year or just overall?
That's the overall price. So it was $3.2 billion was his bid, and that was made up of annual rent payments, but a £616 million down payment. Now, also part of the deal was he was required to pay $200 million worth, or make $200 million worth of improvements to the facility as well, so to the World Trade Center. So at the moment, you're looking at $71 million a year. $71 million a year in debt to the city in taxes alone. $200 million worth of improvements needed to be made to the World Trade Center. So on the face of it, you've got this mass focal point of the New York Manhattan skyline, internationally known wonder of the World Trade Center, the Twin Towers. On the face of it, dig a little bit deeper into the detail, and you've got actually something which is hemorrhaging money, probably a bit run down, $200 million worth of improvements required. What do you think of that? What does that say to you about the actual World Trade Center itself?
Well, it's saying to me, why do we have the World Trade Centers? You know, what usually would happen to a building that's starting to become run down and derelict? What happens to businesses, and let's say assets, that are hemorrhaging money? You either do one or two things. You try to improve them, or you get rid of them.
Yeah.
I think that, to be honest with you, the modernization thing that you're talking about, those pieces of modernization, in the year 2000, just the year before these attacks ensued, there was the elevator modernization project.
Right, okay.
Which was a year before. No doubt we'll touch later on the collapse and the causes, and the elevators then come heavily back into the spotlight. But you are right, there was major renovation works and modernization undergoing at the World Trade Center at the time of its ultimately awful demise.
Another thing to just to be aware of with Larry Silverstein as well, obviously owned the World Trade Center, bought it in April, June of 2001. Upon buying the World Trade Center, he had some amendments made to the insurance policy for the World Trade Center.
Ah, okay.
Now, one of those amendments included the inclusion of a policy which actually covered the buildings themselves for acts of terrorism. Bearing in mind this is June 2001, so he had a clause in his insurance policy added in to cover the buildings for the event of a terrorist attack. June 2001. Larry Silverstein was known very famously for having breakfast in the World Trade Center every single day. 9 o'clock every day, World Trade Center, Larry Silverstein would be there. Funnily enough, on the morning of September the 11th, 2001, his wife had booked him a physical examination. He didn't have breakfast in the World Trade Center on the morning of September the 11th. Very out of character, very strange.
It's all starting to really start to come together a little bit here, isn't it? It doesn't look good, does it? Let's be honest.
It doesn't look good to me, no. So, after obviously the terrorist attacks, of course, Mr. Silverstein, well, he's going to be claiming on his insurance policy at the end of the day, isn't he? So he actually, instead of claiming for one terrorist attack on one facility, he claims two separate incidents, one on each building. He takes it all the way to the high courts in America, and he's awarded $4.2 million in a court of law in America
4.2 million or
4.2 billion,
I was
sorry.
going to say, my God.
He is awarded
4.2 million.
$4.2 billion in an insurance claim against 2 separate terrorist attacks, one plane into the North Tower, one plane into the South Tower. Bearing in mind he's just spent $3.2 billion on it. He's made $4.2 billion back. He's put a £616 million down payment down, and that was probably about it. And he's made $4.2 billion. That's some profit.
It is some profit. I mean, you've got to, again, you tend to try to stand back and look at it. Is it a cruel twist of fate that when he took out that insurance policy literally just a couple of months before the terrorist attacks for the insurance to include a terrorist clause? Was that a cruel twist of fate? Or was it something more sinister?
I'm only looking at the facts at this stage.
Yeah, I mean...
That's all we can do.
Yeah. So that's a brief background of the World Trade Center. Do we have any more on that, or can we move on to the morning of September the 11th in New York City?
Let's move on.
Okay, so early in the morning, midst of rush hour traffic, in the busy cosmopolitan city of New York, Manhattan, downtown. You can imagine it now. The buses whizzing past, the taxis, the yellow taxis beeping their horns, thousands of people on the streets. And you look up when you hear a noise that you don't commonly get associated within the city of New York, which is aeroplanes. A sound of a jetliner proceeding to slam into one of the Twin Towers. Unfortunately for those souls in that building, not only is the plane crashed into the building, it's also vaporized inside the building, and panic ensues. So from this point on, the calls obviously now start to look at the emergency services, to look at exactly what on earth is happening at the World Trade Center. The news crews begin around the world to circulate on the city, and again, the second tower gets hit by another plane, and at this point, there are real issues. But you do have some information, James, relating to potential explosions before any aeroplanes did in fact actually impact the buildings.
Yeah, so there's multiple reports of eyewitnesses, people who were inside the basement of the World Trade Center, actually saying that the explosions were heard before the planes hit.
Right.
There's a clip I've seen on a documentary, and it's back to back clips. It's just person after person after person, obviously being interviewed in the immediate aftermath of the attacks, and they're being asked, what happened, and every single one of them, about 15 people, explosion. And they're all saying explosions. They're not saying crash. They're not saying planes. They're not saying, they're saying explosion.
I'm going to be honest with you here. A lot of first responders were claiming flashes and explosions.
Yeah.
And this was obviously before the planes had even hit. That's a hell of a statement and a hell of a claim.
It is.
To come out on.
Again, why would anybody lie? Who's going to lie about that? This is in the immediate aftermath. At this point, nobody's even sure if it's terrorism or what. They're literally going on impulse at this point. They've just been involved in a traumatic experience, and they're saying, it was an explosion. I heard an explosion. Yeah, alright, a plane hits into a building, it's going to sound like an explosion, but these were people saying there were explosions before the planes hit. People in the basement, the guy was saying that he watched the guy, it was an explosion, he watched one of his colleagues get thrown into a brick wall because of an explosion in the basement. It's
quite outlandish, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's unbelievable when you consider the size of this basement. I mean, this isn't a normal one-floor basement in the World Trade Center. This was set over multiple levels. There was an underground car park. There was a subway station. There was a shopping precinct. And underneath that, there was the bank. Another podcast that we could always talk about is the missing gold from the World Trade Center that day. The gold that was located in that bank was also reported as missing. Another undertone to an unbelievable day. Obviously, what happens from here is the unthinkable happens when the second plane slams into the building, almost slices it in half, straight through the middle. The plane, I think, actually makes it through the other side. A horrendous thing to witness. what I can always remember as a young child watching this was just shock. The first plane had hit, my father had Sky News on. When the second plane hit, one word circulated around the world, beginning with T and ending with M, and that was terrorism.
Yeah.
There's absolutely no doubt about that whatsoever. The buildings then collapse. When these buildings collapse, they collapse in a way that's caused debate. For now 19 years, a huge debate is enthused of whether was this a controlled demolition, or did they just fall down in that effect?
The official explanation is that the buildings fell due to fire. Fire from the jet fuel. I mean, the fire was burning in the buildings for about it was like a 45 minutes or something like that before the first building fell. So what the theory is that the jet fuel caused these intense fires that then melted the steel columns that go up through the middle of the building.
Yeah, you're right. On March the 29th, 2009, some investigators undertook a rough cut test in New Mexico where they concluded that the temperature for jet fuel to start melting these steel columns enough to weaken them for the buildings to collapse had to be at 26,000 degrees. Now, what I can tell you is that the temperature at the World Trade Center wasn't 26,000 degrees. So straight away, there's an anomaly right there, that it wasn't at 26,000 degrees. However, during this rough cut test, they did actually get a piece of smaller metal and then heated it up to around 20,000, I believe. And within 3.5 seconds, you had a complete structural failure. So when your mind starts to take you to, this is a conspiracy theory, this is absolutely outrageous, they've done this to their own people, something then pulls you back towards the arc of normality to say, look, this is a genuine terrorist attack.
What I want to talk about is how they actually found pools. There were pools of molten metal after the event. With all the materials involved, it wasn't possible so the materials involved, I'm talking the steel, the jet fuel, the concrete, it wasn't possible for there to be more than a temperature of more than 800 degrees, unless there was obviously some outside involvement of different chemicals and materials which were not actually officially stated to be involved. Now, there was molten metal found at 1500 degrees, found in the rubble. Now, some of these pools of molten metal were found up to 5 weeks after 9/11. So you're talking 5 weeks after the buildings fell, 1,500 degrees, pools of molten metal.
You're absolutely right. It is the longest burning structural thaw in history. December the 13th it finally went out, which was over 3 months after the attacks.
Conspiracy theorists have pointed to the potential use of a chemical known as thermite.
Correct. Super nanothermite is the thing that's coming out.
So thermite is used in controlled demolitions typically. With the way that the buildings fell, almost in free fall, pancake effect, floor after floor after floor, bang, 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 bang. Almost like a controlled demolition. Now, thermite would be used in this sort of scenario to cut the columns.
Yes.
So imagine the metal columns going up through the building, supporting it. I mean, if the buildings fell due to fire, what you should have been left with was obviously all the concrete and everything else would have fallen. And then you should have really have been left with all these columns just still up there.
Yeah, so if you can imagine it in your mind, you'd be looking at the destruction of a building where the center columns would still be partially standing and the concrete around the building would have fallen around it.
Because obviously the temperatures wouldn't have been hot enough to melt the steel.
Exactly, and it's been found that the temperature wasn't hot enough to actually ensure that these buildings would have actually melted. What I can tell you also is a lot of conspiracy theories state that a lot of debunkers state that it would have been absolutely impossible to get this super thermite onto the steel beams. What I can tell you was something I alluded to earlier on, which was the elevator modernization.
Yeah, exactly.
And that is where they would get the access to these steel columns and steel beams. Now, again, back to this rough cut test in 2009 in New Mexico, they did, the debunkers is what they were called, they did do a test, and this time they used normal thermite, and they also used nanothermite. Can you tell me why they couldn't get hold of the super thermite? Well, there's a reason why you can't get hold of the super thermite. It's a military grade explosive. It's a military grade tool.
Yeah.
If this was an inside job, they would have had to have used military grade style things, because there was no residue allegedly found after the towers had collapsed in the rubble. What I can tell you, at Hangar 17 at JFK is a hangar where they keep all of the rubble, all of the metal columns, all of the busted fire engines, the taxis, the police cars, everything that you can think of was all transported there after the initial event. One crazy theory that has been mooted was the CIA and FBI actually confiscated over 200 steel beams from this Hangar 17, and then, in inverted commas, replaced these 200 steel beams back at the hangar, and they used them for investigative purposes. That to me says that, well, look, could these be the steel frames and the steel that could be in question due to this super thermite?
What I'm inclined to believe, they used this thermite prior to the attacks. It would have been somehow inserted into the building, possibly due when the elevator reconstruction. They would have inserted this thermite in order to allow for the columns to be cut. Now, if you see a typical demolition, you'll see diagonally cut columns, so cut in a certain way, so that as the building, as
as the metal begins to collapse, it will then slide over like a tectonic plate.
Exactly. Now, thermite is used for creating extremely hot temperatures in a controlled area, such as in controlled demolition. So it's a typical feature of a controlled demolition is the use of these sort of things, chemicals.
What I can say is that the first link to George Bush now arrives. A lot of people will say, how on earth would these people get this explosives through security after the 1993 attack? Obviously, security was massively heightened at the World Trade Center. Well, what I can tell you is that George Bush's cousin was in charge of security of the World Trade Center less than 3 months before its ultimately destructive state. George Bush's cousin was in charge of security at the World Trade Center less than 3 months before these towers fell. So if you're looking for any sort of way into the buildings, well, there it is right there, isn't it? That's a fact. That happened. These facts and anomalies still keep popping up, and we will allude to more of them as we go through the pod.
That's right. One final thing on the World Trade Center as well. A World Trade Center structural engineer by the name of Les Robertson is actually on record as saying that the building was designed specifically to be able to take the impact of multiple Boeing 747 planes at any location.
I've heard this before on a memorial video,
right,
that CNN undertook for the Twin Towers. What I can tell you, just a quick one on thermite. In its common form, you get the common sparkler that you would get as a child.
Yeah.
It would spark up and you'd write your name in the darkness from the sparkler. Super thermite can also be painted onto steel beams.
Okay.
But do you want to know a real issue that I've got? Was this wasn't investigated during the 9/11 Commission.
No, wasn't mentioned at all. Neither were the pools of molten metal.
And that's where you get first issues. So, ultimate conclusion from me, was it a controlled demolition? I don't know. And I'm still 50-50. I mean, people at home listening to the podcast, you could be thinking to yourself right now, well, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that there was. But there's also a hell of a lot of evidence to suggest that it wasn't. It would have had to have been one of the greatest ever deceptions of a nation in the world's history. It would have absolutely been undertaken flawlessly. Thousands of people would have had to have been involved in this. What I can tell you is that those buildings, I would think in my mind, when you see a building collapse in New York would fall onto other buildings and create maybe a domino effect of other buildings hitting into each other and falling all over. The way those two buildings went down was outrageous. And when we talk on building number 7 later, that's what sways my mind back to it could have actually been indeed a controlled demolition. James, what's your initial thoughts on that collapse of the towers then?
I think the way they fell, I mean, they fell at a rate of 10 stories, 10 floors per second.
That's right.
Due to fire? I know they got hit by a plane, but officially, the official account of what happened and the cause of them falling is fire. Jet fuel induced fires. I'm sorry, but there have been fires in skyscrapers before, there have been fires in large buildings before, and yeah, they have fallen. Buildings have fallen. Particularly, you think about was it the hotel in Dubai, or it was Dubai or Bombay, and there was a large fire there, and the building did eventually fall, or parts of it did fall.
Parts
but
of
the
it fell
building,
in Dubai.
a building doesn't just fall like that, bang, 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 like a.
It did. It was a bang, bang, bang,
like
bang,
playing
bang,
Jenga.
bang, bang. Yep.
You know, 10 stories, 10 floors per second, almost falling at free fall speed. It's as if somebody's just
Press the button.
pulled the building, yeah.
The thing that gets me whenever I see those people, they call them the jumpers, that jumped out the building, how bad must it have been when you can consider your only way out is to jump? It must be an absolutely horrific decision.
Tragic.
Do you stay and get... I mean, do you take the smoke and hope you become infused by the flames? Or do you be crushed? Or do you jump from the building? It's a horrible situation, and I can only send my deepest condolences to all the families and for the people that suffered on that terrible day.
Yeah, and I don't want it to be confused. Like, obviously, we're debating the wheres, the whys, the hows of all of this. By no means are we saying that this isn't a tragic event. By no means are we saying that this isn't, one of the darkest days in world history.
And it was, wasn't it? And it is. It is one of the darkest days.
It will be forever.
It's absolutely appalling. It's
the biggest tragedy of my lifetime.
Same.
Worldwide, as an international event. But that doesn't mean that we have to accept what's been said to us by people who have a lot to gain from these things happening.
We now move on to the Pentagon. That day on September the 11th, 2001, wasn't just the Twin Towers, there was also multiple incidents. The Pentagon, one of the most heavily defended military installations in the world, America's hub for their armed forces, was again supposedly hit by an airliner. Only one CCTV camera can ever pick up any sort of imagery for us to look at. James, what's your initial thoughts on what happened there? Jetliner, cruise missile, bomb?
The Pentagon is a strange one, because as far as I can tell, other than being told by the official 9/11 Commission, there's really no evidence that a plane was ever there. There's no evidence that it was possible to even perform this sort of maneuver. Bearing in mind, we're talking about amateur pilots, hijackers, members of a terrorist organization. We're not talking about Air Force pilots. We're not talking about the Red Arrows. We're talking about amateur pilots who have learnt to fly planes at a very amateur level.
I'm going to tell you a fact. The person that flew the plane into the Pentagon learned how to fly on Microsoft Windows 98 simulator, flight simulator. A bag was found at the airport with a how to fly manual inside a backpack. How is this guy supposed to fly hundreds of miles from the airport into the Pentagon, and you're going to tell me that it had to undertake a crazy maneuver to hit the Pentagon itself? What maneuver was that?
The maneuver he would have had to have performed, this is according to a American Air Force pilot, would have had to have performed a 270-degree downward spiral in order to put himself in position to hit the Pentagon in the position where it was allegedly hit.
270-degree angle. That is unbelievable.
In a commercial airliner. In a
commercial airliner.
You know, we're not talking about in a Red Arrow. We're talking about in a commercial airliner. I mean, there's probably pilots that will fly planes of all shapes and sizes for their whole careers that wouldn't even dream of attempting that sort of maneuver. And then again, we're talking about an amateur pilot here.
If he's done that, right, I just can't see it as being of a believable statement for an amateur pilot, yet alone, as you say, an experienced pilot to do whatever it was, loop the loop, fly it 2 meters off the ground into the building. And some more facts on it. No physical evidence of an airliner was found at the Pentagon. No wreckage with a positive serial number was found at the Pentagon. Maneuvers from this pilot were indeed questionable. No tail, no wing imprint. Pictures seem to show material blowing out of the building rather than going into the building, suggesting that it could have been a missile. It could have been a cruise missile. One thing that comes out from the commission report was that this plane vaporized on impact, where the pilots would have been situated and found at the outer ring of the Pentagon, and then the passengers all pushed through to the inner ring.
Yeah, these particular aircraft as well, they ran on 2 Rolls-Royce engines made of steel and titanium. It's scientifically impossible for 12 tons of steel and titanium to vaporize. It's not possible. On impact, no sign of it, but then they did also discover DNA and fingerprints. So you're telling me 12 tons of steel and titanium vaporizes with no trace of it whatsoever, but DNA and fingerprints survived?
There's a lot of unanswered questions here, and a lot of things are not adding up. Where you look at the rendering where the people at the University of Purdue undertook a 2-year study to complete a full render of not only the Twin Towers but also the Pentagon as well, and they concluded that indeed it was a terrorist attack. Now, these people could have been put up to it, but one thing that doesn't add up is on a lot of images that you see, the whole of the Pentagon doesn't actually match up to the size of the aircraft that was supposedly hitting the building. What you were going to get is a long tube which creates a hole.
Yeah.
But they're missing one crucial element. The wings.
Yeah, the wings. Another strange thing about the Pentagon situation. The next day, CIA agents gathered any debris from the lawn in front of the Pentagon where the plane is allegedly hit. This didn't become a major crime scene. This didn't go through a thorough investigation. This didn't go through forensics. No, they dumped dirt, sand, gravel, mud over the entire lawn to quite literally cover it up.
So you're saying that even now there could still be potential items of interest under the lawn of the Pentagon?
Potentially.
Yet it also states no physical evidence of an airliner was found. So what they're going to be covering up was just surely debris coming out of this.
Debris.
Is it a bomb? I mean, I'm thinking the CCTV image that we've all seen on YouTube, we've all saw on TV programs, is a grainy image of, again, one of the most heavily defended, fortified military installations in the world with one CCTV camera. Come on.
Yeah, I know. There is allegedly other CCTV footage which was
Well, where are
immediately
they?
confiscated by the FBI, and it to this day remains at the Department of Justice. And
Why?
And they refuse to release it.
Yeah, and that's the question that the families want answered. That's the question that we want answered, that everybody wants answered, is where are they? Where are the CCTV images? Why will they not release them?
I don't know. I couldn't tell you. Couldn't tell you.
The Pentagon final word from me is I genuinely think that's a more conclusive terror attack than the Twin Towers for me. I think that's a dead cert. I am 90% sure that was done by the FBI or the CIA themselves. I believe that happened. You can call me crazy, call me wild, wacky, whatever you like.
It was a false flag operation.
I believe that is more believable than what happened in New York City. Going back over to New York City, building number 7, Jesse Ventura went on to the Piers Morgan show in America when Piers was over there to really have a debate on what happened on 9/11, and he believes it was a false flag operation. Former governor of Minnesota, may I add, and what I will say is that Jesse clearly states that this was an inside job, and he also says that the BBC conducted a pre-broadcast in New York City claiming that building number 7 had indeed collapsed. But here's the curveball. As that broadcast is being recorded, the building is behind her and it's still standing. It's not collapsed yet. And then guess what happens later? The building collapses in a perfect pancaked effect as the Twin Towers did. Now, this wasn't hit by any airliner. This wasn't hit by any fire. How on earth could that happen? Do you have any information on that, James?
Well, the building 7, again, the official word is that it fell due to fire, owing to the debris falling from the fall of the building, the north and south tower. That's the official line. Again, much like the Twin Towers, molten metal was found underneath in the rubble. Bearing in mind this building was 47 stories high, and it only had fire on 2 or 3 floors.
That's not right. I mean, straight away you would find, like we mentioned about the Twin Towers, you would find that would have been a partial collapse. You know, is it any significance that the tenants of this building were the CIA and FBI?
That building could have been saved. I don't care.
And who owned this building again?
It was Larry Silverstein.
Ah, that name for the second time now.
So he already actually owned this building. I mean, an outlandish theory I've sort of heard before is that they kind of used Building 7 as a bit of a control room. Call me crazy. I'm not saying I believe this. This is just a theory that I've heard. They used Building 7 as a control room for the controlled demolition of the Twin Towers. So the North and South Tower. Once obviously the Twin Towers had fallen, they needed a way in which to conceal all the evidence. They pulled the building like a controlled demolition.
Now, what we do have to say is these views are of our own velocity. We're not stating that this is fact. This is purely a conspiracy theory and a disclaimer that needs to be brought out. Again, what we will also say is there is another string attached to this god-awful day, which was Flight 93. Another flight that was allegedly headed back into Washington to the biggest building of them all, was the White House. Audio has emerged from this flight where there was panic from the passengers, where one of the passengers screams down the phone at an operator saying, "We're all going to die in here." So clearly there was a hijacking, no doubt about that whatsoever. And that building then falls. It crashes into the ground. But again, another anomaly. But again, there is another problem. Vaporizing on impact with no debris. And wasn't it over 6 miles?
There were 2 separate crash sites, 6 miles apart.
Yeah.
I'm no expert on plane crashes, believe me. This is obviously in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. But yeah, it took 2 miles apart, and all there was just a weird sort of blast crater. No real evidence of a plane, just a couple of blast craters. 6 miles apart. I don't know an awful lot about that particular incident, but I just know that. And that to me is odd.
I think it's, again, outrageous. There is actually a couple of films released about Flight 93. Really good film where the passengers retook control of the flight, but unfortunately for the passengers, there was no pilots. So, you know, obviously our thoughts and prayers go out to the victims of that one there. Moving on to the alleged terrorists. We're going to give a quick segment to the alleged terrorists. James, take it away.
So, with regards to the terrorists, obviously the main one everybody hears about is Osama bin Laden. Who was responsible for 9/11, you ask? Well, it was Al-Qaeda. That's the general answer you get back from people, isn't it?
Yes.
It was Al-Qaeda. It was Osama bin Laden. It was Al-Qaeda.
Correct.
There's also a theory that there was no prior warning. There was no prior warning. It was without warning. In the days after 9/11, Condoleezza Rice, George Bush, Mr. Dick Cheney, they all came out and said there was no warning. Not true. 2 years prior, in the years leading up to 9/11, NORAD, which is a North American
Air defense.
air defense.
Yep.
They actually ran training drills to deal specifically with the potential of planes being hijacked. And one of the targets they used as part of their training exercise was the World Trade Center. A part of Operation Moscow 2000, they simulated planes flying into the Pentagon.
It's all a bit too too close for comfort.
It is. The Federal Aviation Administration received 52 separate warnings about Al-Qaeda in the 6 months leading up to 9/11. At least 12 separate countries warned the US of intelligence acquired of an imminent attack on America, including British intelligence, Italian, and these were all raised as concern to America at the Geneva summit.
So you believe that these were potentially just downright overlooked by the American government?
Bearing in mind Condoleezza Rice, George Bush, Dick Cheney in the days after said there was no warning.
There was a warning.
There was a warning. There was warning.
There was multiple warnings.
Exactly. So the 19 hijackers then, you've got the Mohammed Atta. He's known as the ringleader. Just to go a bit deeper, all very strange. There's a guy named Mohammed Ahmed. He requested that $100,000. So Mohammed Ahmed, he's the head of the ISI, which is the Pakistan Secret Service. So it's the equivalent of the FBI in Pakistan.
Okay, yeah.
He requested that $100,000 was wired to Mohammed Atta being the ringleader in the days leading up to 9/11. Why would he do that? No inquiry was ever made into why this was done. The 9/11 Commission, they never even investigated it, and the official quote from the 9/11 Commission was, it was deemed financing of the attacks of little practical significance to the investigation.
Well, I think the significance is huge.
It's massive. And just as a final little point on that one, on the morning of 9/11, Mohammed Ahmed, bearing in mind he's the head of the ISI, the Pakistan Secret Service. Where was Osama bin Laden found, by the way, when they found him eventually?
Was in Hyderabad in Pakistan.
He was in Pakistan. On the morning of 9/11, Mohammed Ahmed, he was having breakfast with government officials in Washington.
That's outrageous.
This is the man who requested for $100,000 to be wired to Mohammed Atta, who was the alleged ringleader of the 9/11 attacks.
They've obviously been highly unlucky with the way things have lined up, or incredibly stupid as to make it that obvious. I mean, they do say when you're trying to cover something up or you're trying to hide something, what do you do?
Hiding in plain sight.
Exactly. And is that what they've tried to do? But it doesn't look good, does it? $100,000 wired to the ringleader of the potential 9/11 attacks, and you're sat there having breakfast in Washington on the morning of September the 11th.
I know, it's incredible. It is incredible. There's also been lots of talk about planting of evidence, so allegedly there were passports found in the rubble of so-called hijackers. Several of the official 19 hijackers, everybody's seen the pictures, haven't they? You know, it was on the front of every newspaper in the world in the days after. There was 19 hijackers.
There's one that sticks out for me.
That's Mohammed Atta.
He's the one with the bags under his eyes. Is the eyes?
That's Mohammed
Is this
Atta.
the man who says, we have some planes, everybody stay calm, we're returning to the airport?
So he's the guy who received $100,000 from Mohammed Ahmed, who was having breakfast with government officials in Washington on the day. Out of the 19 hijackers, at least 7 of them are still alive. The FBI to this day has not revised its list to take out those 7 who are still alive.
So 7... Hold on a minute. So for the listeners and the viewers, you're stating that 7 of the hijackers are still alive and the FBI refused to take them off of the list.
Yes.
This is unreal.
There's a guy called Abdulaziz Al-Omari who was officially named as one of the 19 hijackers. There's a direct quote from him. He's still alive, and this is a direct quote. "I'm still alive. I have no idea how to fly a plane."
Well,
he's still on the official list.
But the thing is...
He's alive.
The thing is, although that's an unbelievable quote, is it exactly that? Is it unbelievable? Why has he never come out to the world's press? Has he been paid off? Is he...
Who controls the world's press?
Rupert Murdoch.
Who's gonna publish that interview?
You would find that the only way to publish something like that would be through an unofficial media outlet that may get closed down before it hits. But
if that was ever to be found, it would never see the light of day.
It's still a highly controversial claim.
It's unbelievable.
Yeah.
So at least five of the hijackers, of these 19 hijackers, at least 5 of them are reported to have direct links to US military institutions as well themselves. The main one, though, everybody knows, Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden is of Saudi Arabian descent.
Yeah.
He's actually from a very rich family in Saudi Arabia. They were made their fortune in construction in Saudi Arabia, and they're one of few non-royal, high society elite families in Saudi Arabia.
Okay.
So obviously you have all the sheikhs over there. They weren't actually born into royalty. His father made a lot of money from construction, so they're very rich out there. Now, in January of 2001, the FBI were ordered to back off when investigating the bin Laden family. Osama bin Laden has 2 relatives who were living in Falls Church, Virginia. Falls Church, Virginia is 9 miles away from CIA headquarters. While he was on America's Most Wanted list, so he was America's Most Wanted criminal, he spent 2 weeks at the US hospital in Dubai, and he was visited by a local CIA agent.
This is all too close to home.
And there's also no evidence at all linking Osama bin Laden to any planning of 9/11. Not a single shred of evidence. They claim that there was no evidence needed to convict him because they went to Afghanistan and they found a tape of him confessing to 9/11.
I think that's outrageous.
So they went to Afghanistan, they happened to find a tape of him saying that he did 9/11. Also, the actual translation of the tape has been heavily challenged by actual people who speak Arabic. That's very strange. So there's a guy, he is Osama bin Laden's brother. His name was Salim bin Laden. Salim bin Laden was a close personal friend of George Herbert Walker Bush, so George W. Bush's father, former president, as well. They were close friends. And
also head of the CIA.
Yeah. So they were close friends. Herbert Walker Bush was involved in business ventures with Salim bin Laden. Now, Salim bin Laden, when he started doing major investments in the US into businesses and property and that sort of thing, he engaged a man called Jim Bath to handle all of his investments in the US on behalf of the bin Laden family. Jim Bath is a close friend of George W. Bush, and they were former guard pilots together in the US Air Force. It doesn't stop there.
There's more.
There is a company called the Carlyle Group. The Carlyle Group, they use George Bush Sr. as sort of a bit of a figurehead. He's heavily involved in the Carlyle Group. They're an investment firm. George Bush Sr. is known to have travelled to Saudi Arabia in 1998 and in the year 2000, specifically to meet with the bin Laden family on behalf of the Carlyle Group. Now, on the morning of 9/11, the Carlyle Group are holding a conference in Washington. In attendance, Osama bin Laden's brother.
Salim.
Exactly. And this Carlyle Group, they have links to the world's largest defense contractors. What's the best, if you're the world's largest defense contractor, what's the best thing that can happen to your business?
To be the main provider of military hardware to the biggest military in the world, which is the United States of America.
What do you need to happen?
You need a war to happen.
You need a war to happen. Exactly. That's some interesting bits there on bin Laden. He's not just some random guy, which we were all led to believe at the time. Oh my God, who's this guy that lives in Afghanistan? He wants to hurt everyone. Because as kids, when this all happened, that's what we were led to believe.
Yeah, of course, they were calling him Osama bin Laden. I remember at school, this guy wanted to take us out. He was already on the FBI's most wanted list before 9/11. He was already known to American authorities. Well, you know, what we will say, just to briefly summarize it, there was links between the Bush administration, the Bush's father, to the Bin Laden family, which is all a bit close to home. I mean, think about it. The president of one of the biggest military powers, superpowers in the world, is very, very close business partners and friends with someone who has instigated the biggest international terror attack in the history of the world. You couldn't write it, you couldn't even make it up. What we will do to summarize, I mean, we've been through nearly all of it. We could probably do another podcast and talk about it all day. As far as I'm concerned, I'm looking at this and I'm saying, my conclusion, I believe that the powers of the United States of America and authority knew that this was going to happen, and I think they let it happen. I think how the slow response from the F-16 fighter pilots, everything, I just believe that there needs to be subpoenas actioned and reopen the 9/11 Commission and reinvestigate exactly what happened on this day, because there's too many unanswered questions, and I believe that they let it happen. Another false flag operation to go to war. James, what do you think happened?
Just to touch again on the 9/11 Commission. The 9/11 Commission didn't even mention Building 7 at all.
Outrageous again.
The 9/11 Commission, they ordered George W. Bush and Dick Cheney to appear separately. They declined. They only agreed to appear at the 9/11 Commission under very strict terms of their own. One of those was that they appeared together, despite the request that they appeared separately. One of the requests was that they were not under oath.
Why?
Not under oath. I don't know why. No press or family members were allowed to be present, and no recording of any kind was to take place during the 9/11 investigation when Bush and Cheney were being questioned. Who was the head of the 9/11 Commission, James?
I don't know.
It was a guy named Philip Zelikow, and he is a close friend of Condoleezza Rice, and he headed it all up.
It seems to be an inside investigation from the alleged inside jobbers, really. I mean, for me, do you think it's an inside job then, James?
It's very hard to say. There's so much to unpack, and I don't think we've even really touched the surface of it.
No.
There's a lot to unpack when it comes to 9/11. If you go down that rabbit hole,
you may never re-emerge.
You may never know what you're going to sort of find, and depending on where you look, it can take you down different paths. It's one of those things, really, 9/11, and I always say to people, because I've been aware of a lot of these conspiracy theories for a long time, over a decade now, and then people say to me, "Oh, well, why do you think it? Why do you think this?" And you can't just explain to somebody. You can't just go, "Oh, well, because this happened, or because this happened," because individually these things are not enough. You have to unpack the whole thing. You have to do your own research. You have to go down that rabbit hole yourself if you're willing to be open-minded about it. Because it's very easy to say to somebody, well, 9/11 was Al-Qaeda, 9/11 was an inside job. You can't be so firm on each side. You have to do your own research is the main thing that I would say. The more you look, the more you'll find. Me personally, I think an environment was created at the time where this situation benefited a lot of people. It benefited the Bush administration. It benefited companies like the Carlyle Group, who were massive investors in military equipment companies. It benefited probably the Bin Laden family. It benefited Larry Silverstein. Ultimately, it benefited American interests in the Middle East. It's very difficult. It's the whole thing's so shady.
You could argue and say it's the back door to war. I think, look, we invite our listeners to really comment underneath on the comments page of our YouTube page when this goes live, to tell us what you think and any other things that you think we should be looking into. One thing that we do have to mention as well, Glamour and Goosebumps, to our people who, and our listeners who wouldn't know what that is. We have Kelsey, an American in Dallas in Texas, that has agreed to do another podcast with us. Another one in the TTM conspiracy segment. We have the alleged abduction of Travis Walton. A film called Fire in the Sky was dedicated to this abduction. Kelsey is a makeup artist and also a YouTuber that applies makeup and also tells these conspiracy theories. Catch her link in the bio of this video, and just keep a lookout for that one. That'll be a really, really, really good cross-promotional video where we discuss the disappearance of Travis Walton and more on the TTM podcast. We're going to leave you with 2 inspirational quotes from 2 former US presidents. The first one is this: "Our enemies have made the mistake that America's enemies always make. They saw liberty and thought they saw weakness." President George H.W. Bush. "America will never be destroyed from the outside. If we falter and lose our freedoms, it will be because we destroyed ourselves." President Abraham Lincoln. Ladies and gentlemen, this podcast is available on Spotify, Anchor, and Apple Podcast. Also available on YouTube. All major social networks are covered by the podcast. Just search TTM Pods. James Hounsell, thank you very much for being another great host on our show. Thank you very much for your time. Have you enjoyed this podcast?
Yeah, it's a subject that I always like to get into. I think we should revisit it. I think there's a lot more to touch on. I think we've only just scraped the surface on that. If the demand is there, we will go deeper.
Yeah, we could do an episode directly on the hijackers. We could do an episode into the 9/11 Commission report. I mean, live on the podcast, we're discussing what we could potentially do next. What I will say is, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for tuning in to the TTM podcast, and we are out.